Martin is the Director of Education and Guest Experiences at Gunston Hall, where she has worked for 6 years. During that time, she has led new programming initiatives, the development of a major long-term exhibition, and a revision of the museum school field trips. And then congratulations to Gunston Hall. Yesterday, the staff received the Virginia Association of Museums 2021 Museum Innovation Award. So we congratulate you for that, and we're really looking forward to hearing from all of you. So thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you for inviting us. We are thrilled to be with everyone who has joined for the Second Cup conversation, and we've been so pleased to be able to attend some of the other talks. This is a great series, really a wonderful way for us to get to know some of the other NSCDA sites. So again, thank you for including us, and thank you to everyone who has come to hear a little bit about growing history at Gunston Hall. We're going to start by hearing from Scott Stroh. He is our executive director and has been with Gunston Hall for more than 8 years. His leadership has enabled us to do unbelievably great things to transform our organization. And I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Scott to you right now.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Tina. It's really a privilege and an honor to be with you all this morning and just echo what Rebecca has said about how wonderful this series is. It's a great opportunity to connect and learn about so many of these wonderful sites around the country. And we're just really thrilled and honored to be invited to join you all this morning. On behalf of our Board of Regents and our phenomenal staff team, I'm very pleased to extend greetings to you all, to Gunston Hall. Really excited about what you will hear this morning about what we've been doing and how we've been growing history at Gunston Hall. You know, it has been, as I know you all know and understand, an unprecedented last 12 months. You know, we just had our own sort of internal recognition of the 1-year anniversary of when we were first required to close. And as part of just recognizing that we've reached that 12-month mark, I think we've all spent a lot of time reflecting on what the last 12 months has meant to us personally and professionally. And certainly that's true for me. And I've been asked the question a couple of times in the last week, well, you know, when you think about the last 12 months, what do you think about? What do you think about in relation to your work at Gunston? And what I will tell and share with all of you is some of the initial reactions that I have had are just pride, sort of a sense of just being inspired by what this organization and all the members of our team have been able to accomplish, as you'll hear a little bit more about in just a few minutes. But we have been innovative, we have been creative, we have been flexible, professional, compassionate, and really couldn't be more proud of our organization. With tremendous leadership from our Board of Regents and tremendous support from all of you and the Dames and the National Society, we have navigated the last 12 months with incredible success and resilience. And I just could not be more proud and inspired by all that we have achieved. Just a couple things very briefly to note. I encourage you all to visit gunstonhall.org, our website. One of the things that we have been very successful at doing is pivoting from 100% physical on-site programs to 100% virtual programs. And there's a wonderful portion of our website, Learning at Home. If you just go to the website and find the Learning at Home tab, there is a tremendous amount of not just information, but recordings from past programs and experiences that we facilitated in a virtual setting. And I encourage you all to go to that Learning at Home page and check out as many or all of those programs as you can. It's really been phenomenal to see how we have transitioned so quickly. And I think now, Rebecca, we're up over 50 virtual programs that we've facilitated since we closed last March. And we've reached over 30,000 people through those programs from Europe and throughout the United States. So it's been a wonderful experience for all of us. And it's been great to see so many other people like we are doing today, able to connect and visit Gunston Hall from further afield than would ordinarily be the case. So please check out that website. We've also been very fortunate to be able to continue a number of important capital projects at Gunston Hall over the course of our public closure. And we did close last March. We were able to open our grounds last July and resume tours last August. obviously with all the protocols in place, but throughout that period of time, our capital projects have been able to continue, most notably amongst them, the restoration of the Riverside Garden, which you'll hear a little bit more about this morning. And again, just want to thank all of you, all of our friends at the Powder Magazine for this wonderful series, all of you for your incredible and generous support of Gunston Hall. And all those who have sent not only their generous financial support, but so many of you all have also sent words of encouragement, words of motivation, and words of appreciation. And I know, speaking for all of us here at Gunston Hall, we certainly value your financial support, and that's been critically important, but those notes of encouragement and appreciation have really inspired and motivated us to continue to do the best we possibly can during this challenging time. So thanks all of you. I am going to sign off here in just a few minutes, but again, thank you for the opportunity to extend greetings. Thank you for the opportunity to join you. And that said, I will turn it back over to Rebecca. Enjoy the program. Have a great day. All the best. We hope to see you at Gunston Hall soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Right. Well, we are so excited to talk with you about our garden project, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you may see some slides. So this will take just a moment. Oh, right. And there we are. So we are talking about growing history at Gunston Hall. We have, for the last 40 years, been researching the 18th century garden that was at the site during the period that George and Ann Mason lived there. And we, for the last 4 years, have been reconstructing what we've discovered was there. Our research continues. We will never be done, but we have learned a tremendous amount, as you can imagine, in those last 40 years, and we are putting it to work. Here is an artist's rendering of what we're creating. We are very far along in this project. The pandemic put us a little bit farther behind than we had hoped. So the construction isn't 100% done yet. There's still what you can't see. If you were to look to the left of our logo, you'd see down the hillside and the terracing that was created in the 18th century. And that terracing still needs to be finished. So it is still a construction site, but we are inside the garden space and doing planting already. And here you can see that last summer, in the late summer, we did a lot of planting of the boxwood that formed the boxwood border for the garden, one of the main structural components of that garden. You may remember, if any of you have ever visited Gunston Hall, that we had boxwood that was planted during the Mason era. It was about 240 years old, and it was a very, very special feature of the property. It had gotten to be very, 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 very old, and it was in really poor condition. And so we saved the genetic material. We have hundreds of cuttings from the boxwood, but here you can see we're planting new boxwood to replace that other boxwood that was at the end of its life. You can see we have just started here to plant our very first vegetable crops. After all of the period of construction, you can imagine that the soil is pretty compacted, or was compacted, and needed some amelioration. And so that's one of the things that we've been working on. And you'll see some images a little later that will help you see more about that. But we're so excited. We have been really successful in not only creating the structure of the garden, but starting to get that soil in really great condition, and to add to some of the biodiversity in terms of insects who will help us pollinate and keep that garden in great shape. And we're off to a fantastic start. So there you can see some of our insect helpers from last summer. So let me actually go back to our overall artist rendering, and I'm going to invite our archaeologist, Dave Shagno, to talk with us a little bit right now about how we know what we know. So I mentioned that we have been doing all of these years of archaeological excavations, and Dave has been involved in about 20 years of that work. And so he knows, as you can imagine, a tremendous amount, and is the person who's led much of the work that has discovered a lot of the features that we've been able to recreate. So Dave, help us understand a little bit more about what we've learned.
All right. It doesn't seem like 20 years, I can tell you that, but Gunston Hall has been thinking a long time about recreating the garden that George Mason had during his lifetime during the 18th century. And one of the problems we have in understanding the landscape here at Gunston Hall is that we don't have any documentation from Mason's time. So doing archaeology here has special challenges, and it makes it very interesting to me because it's like putting together some sort of a giant, beautiful puzzle, trying to find out what the various elements in the garden and the landscape were during George Mason's time. Now that difficulty of not having any documentation is compounded by the fact that after George Mason's time, the space that his garden occupied was used for various different purposes. The period after his death until around the year 1880, we just don't know what was going on out there. But we have a photograph from the year 1880, which shows that this area was occupied by a pear orchard. Then the next view we have of the garden is about 1920, when it looks like the space is occupied by some sort of agricultural crops. Then a little later in the 1920s, the then owner, Louis Hurdle, created a very Italianate garden in this space, complete with a very large garden pavilion with a reflecting pool with a fish pond and all of the other paraphernalia that a Italianate garden might have. And it was not based at all on the garden that George Mason had here. When the Commonwealth exercised their control over Gunston Hall, a colonial revival garden was put in this space, and this garden was not based on any actual information that we might have had about the original 18th century garden, but rather was an idealization of what a colonial garden might look like. This is what was here when I first came to Gunston Hall, and the only elements of that garden that, I should say, the only elements in that garden of the 18th century garden was the boxwoods, which flanked the central walkway through the garden, and also the terrace that was at the end of the garden. Now, I said we really didn't have any information about landscape elements, and that's not quite true. One of Mason's sons, John, during the end of his life, wrote a recollection, which he talks about his life here with his father as a child. And in that recollection, he does mention certain things in the landscape, but he doesn't really tell us exactly where they were or what they look like. As far as the garden goes, he says there was a garden that extended from the riverfront of the house, which is the front we're seeing here, down to a declivity that overlooked the river and overlooked a deer park. And this declivity was about 100 feet from the deer park, above the deer park. And he said at the upper side, or the upper end of this declivity, there were several falls. And what he meant by that, there were several terrace steps. When I first arrived here, the terrace had just one step. It had a broad platform below the lip of the terrace. And our work in archaeology was able to discover that Mason's terrace did not exactly look like that. There were 3 terrace steps, and there was in the center, there was a platform that was level with the garden. And this platform had the same dimensions as the house, and that would be 40 by 60 feet. And this is the structure that we're currently attempting to recreate on this terrace. And as you can imagine, whereas when Mason constructed this, he was mainly removing material. And to rebuild this, we have to add material, and that creates certain structural problems, which are currently being worked on. Our first job is, as far as trying to determine what this garden looked like, was to try to determine what the actual boundaries were. And to do that, we look for a fence around the perimeter of the garden. And that is kind of a difficult process, because what we're looking for are just sort of little blobs of a different color soil where the fence post holes were. And these were, in the case of our garden, were about about a foot underneath the current soil. The soil had been disturbed above all those post holes. So we did finally find the location of the fence. We found evidence of posts at 10-foot intervals around the perimeter of the fence. Okay, good. And that fence has now been recreated. The other things we're looking for were walkways in the garden. We had, at the time, we had one walkway going down through the center of the garden, which was bounded by these boxwoods, which had overgrown, which at that time had overarched the garden walkway. And that walkway was about 4 feet wide, and it was surfaced with crushed shell. What we found was that central walkway in Mason's time was 12 feet wide, and it was surfaced with pebbles, and it was constructed to last. It had heavy clay at the bottom. It had cobbles on top of that clay, and it had smaller cobbles on top of the larger cobbles, and it was finally finished with water rolled pebbles. We also found the other walkways that are shown here, which divide the garden into squares. And this is exactly what John Mason mentioned in his recollection, that the garden was in fact divided into squares by gravel walkways. We have not been able to identify any specific planting beds in the main part of the garden because of all the disturbances that had happened here in the past. The orchard and the other gardening efforts had pretty much obliterated the original 18th century planting beds, except in the area between the house and the walkway that runs parallel to the house, that walkway. We did find 4.5 foot wide planting beds flanking that walkway. Now, these planting beds at present, or at the time we found them, were about 6 inches below the surface, and they were level with the old gravel walkway. Now, what is interesting is that the planting beds consisted of a dark humic soil, which had been placed in trenches that had actually been dug into the native soil. And this soil had artifacts in it, which were almost identical to the artifacts that we were finding in the places around the kitchen yard where trash and organic waste had been deposited. So what it looks like, they had taken this compost that had formed around the kitchen yard and used it to fill in the trench they had dug along the walkway here to form their planting beds. I might add that we also found some seeds in this soil, and it is difficult though to determine whether those seeds came in with the soil or they represent plants that were actually put in that planting bed. Okay, I think I've taken my allotted time, Rebecca, and at the end of this, I'll answer any questions you might have about our archaeology.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Dave. I am continually amazed at how much we're able to find in the soil that tells us really incredible stuff about what was here. I do want to make sure that we don't forget some of the other ways that we learned about what was in the garden. So we're very envious, I must confess, of some of our peer sites in Virginia and in other places. When we look to places such as Mount Vernon and Monticello, we see that they have beautiful drawings that people made in the 18th century of what their garden spaces looked like. They have detailed descriptions of exactly what the garden contained and how it was arranged, and we just don't have that. So we're so pleased at what we've been able to recover archaeologically. And we also are very pleased at, I wanted to make sure you all got a chance to see Dave at work, by the way. So there's Dave out digging, which he does for most of the year. He'll start again soon. But we've also been very, very lucky to be able to find through some of the letters that George Mason sent and received some of the information about what he was thinking about in terms of plants and what he was planting. Fruit trees are on our mind right now because we are just getting ready to put into the garden space the fruit trees that we hope will be there for decades. And so here is an excerpt from a letter that George Mason wrote to his son John, the one who wrote the Recollections, who was in France at the time. This is from 1780. And you can see that George has a lot of ideas about fruit trees. And this is just one of many letters where he talks about this kind of thing. We have supplemented what we've learned from George Mason's letters and from what was happening at other nearby properties with information from gardening manuals of the time period. And here are just a couple of excerpts, again, about fruit trees, what's proper and what the different kinds of fruit trees produce. And here we can see from again, some gardening manuals, not just information about what kinds of fruit trees one might want, but how one should arrange those fruit trees. And so we're very, very lucky to be able to pull together that sort of detail from 18th century gardening manuals. And then we've finally used also a lot of visual resources. Here is a party of gentlemen in a garden space. They look as if they're quite animated in what they're talking about. And we can imagine such discussions happening in the garden at Gunston Hall. Finally, we have been collecting some of the material culture to help populate the garden properly. And this is a garden roller, really important for things like creating those walkways that Dave was just talking about. All right, may I introduce now our horticulturist, Ryan Dostal. Ryan, if you can help us learn just a little bit more about what are we actually growing in this new garden space?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Rebecca. It's kind of amazing because all of that research goes into, we know all of these plants and it's hard to understate the diversity in the 18th century garden, and especially ones such as the garden at Gunston Hall. We're talking literally about hundreds of plants. And if we look at the image here, we can see those boxwood lining the main paths, the ones we all saw that were installed. But moving from those paths into the beds, that's a 9-foot border. And in that border was planted hundreds and then dozens of different types of shrubs, perennials and annual flowers, as well as bulbs. And so the diversity there is tremendous, and it's really showy. It's certainly the part of the garden that was the idea that you'd be focusing on. The back of that 9-foot bed, there's some lines there, and those represent the fruit trees that we're going to be growing, and those will be trained in cordon. And that's creating sort of a screening barrier so that any visitor walking would see those really nice things in the front and see a lot less of the sort of productive work that's going on in the garden, growing the vegetables, which would have been in the main planting beds. And I like the numbers. It's sort of interesting. Roughly 87% of the bed feet in this garden is devoted to food production. Though, of course, any visitor coming in would probably not be commenting on that. They're going to really be focusing on how the space is arranged, which is certainly to enjoy the beautiful plants that are grown in those pleasure garden sections. The diversity in layout is also fascinating because for George Mason, this was really an expression of knowledge, his resources, and his connections. We see here a lot of order and symmetry in this garden space. And this is really the highest expression of order in this really big landscape that included the terraces that we talked about, the deer park, and also an arrangement of cherry trees that were out in front of the house as well. And so George Mason was certainly speaking to his peers, and if they didn't understand what he was talking about, he was happy to educate them as to why these features were especially important. Now, of course, a garden this size, and it is an acre, would require an immense amount of resources to maintain and upkeep. And George Mason's ability to use enslaved laborers and gardeners, perhaps like Cato or Orinoco, really was an expression of the resources he had at his command and his ability to keep this space in really good repair. Even our small kitchen gardens that we may have, a 10 by 10 or a patio garden, we know that it just takes so much time and attention to do really good work. And finally, there's this idea of connections. George Mason and Virginians in general are really connected to this broader world. And so they have access to all of these different crops that are really coming from around the world, especially Europe. He'll write often to his son, who's in France, for seeds, Africa, and also indigenous crops that are coming here as well. So it's just really amazing, all of the things that we can glean and things that we can see just from the plants that are being grown and just how they're being arranged in the garden space.
Thank you. That was great. That was a fantastic overview, and I'm sure people are going to have questions for you a little bit later. So hang on, everybody, with those questions, and let's move on to a little bit more information about something that both Dave and Ryan hinted at, and that's the relationship between the house and the garden. And for that, I'd like to invite our School and Youth Programs Coordinator, Dylan McCartney, to speak. And I'm going to go back to a slide that shows us that artist rendering of the garden and the mansion.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so as Dave and Ryan were alluding to, the garden is not just an outdoor space. It's really an extension of the mansion. We can't properly understand life at Gunston Hall and life within this property without having the garden there, without being able to use this space to talk about life in the 18th century. It is really an extension of this domestic sphere. It is easy to imagine George Mason, the amount of effort and labor that he had assigned to this space, how important it was to him, to his life at Gunston Hall. The way it's laid out, it's made to impress visitors. And George Mason, as a wealthy plantation owner, as a member of the landed gentry here in Virginia, was expected to host a lot of guests. And these guests would come out into his garden to enjoy this space. And it's in these spaces, in these visits, in George Mason just kind of meandering out from his little parlor, his study there, to walk around his garden space, that Mason is beginning to share some of the ideas that he's articulating in the letters that he's writing, in the documents that he will eventually write, like the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Some of these conversations are happening and being formed within this garden space, this domestic sphere. And one of the important things to remember about the garden and that white fence, it's a sheltered oasis. It is both outdoors and natural, but it's also very controlled nature. And the fence is not just a barrier to nature, to this wall to create this domestic space. It's also keeping out and also separating, clearly delineating the working aspects of Gunston Hall. The kitchen yard is just off to the side of the garden, and this white fence acted as a barrier, keeping that hustle and bustle, keeping the individuals who worked in that environment, the enslaved workers, from seeing or being seen by guests within the garden space. Those enslaved workers may never have been able to go into the garden It may have been this space that was kept separate from them, unless they had a reason to go into the garden for work, like Cato might have, for instance. It's unlikely that they were unable to enjoy this environment. And this environment was enjoyed frequently by the Masons. Large parties, grand soirees are being held in this space, in those green spaces right alongside of the mansion space there. And standing on the outside of the fence, you would be able to hear these noises. You would be able to hear the laughter, the tinkling of glasses. You may even be able to hear the conversations where George Mason is talking about how unjust it is that they're being taxed, how unjust it is and against their natural rights as men, that they don't have the right to vote within British Parliament. And as an enslaved worker, what might be going through your mind when you hear these conversations and when you hear this happening, just feet away on the other side of this white fence. So that is somewhat briefly how the garden relates to the mansion and how it helps us to complete the story of life here at Gunston Hall.
Thank you, Dylan. We've tried to give you an overview of the project, what we've learned, how we know what's here, what we're creating, why it's important to Gunston Hall. We want you to learn a little bit, though, about also how we're using it today. So we're not just creating something that is a perfect time capsule of the past, but we're creating a working garden that is an important place for us for telling stories about Gunston Hall of the past and a place for us to do some important work right now. So to talk about that, I'd like to introduce our education manager, the person in charge of all of our public programs, and that is Lacey Vilova.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can we stay on this slide for just a moment, please? Thank you. So we're looking at an artist rendering of the garden, and I wanted to stay here for just a moment because one of the things that the artist who designed this image included is all of the people within this space. So you can see family groups, you can see a mom with a stroller, and even a school tour sitting in a circle on what we call the bowling green up next to the house. So this space is, as Dylan mentioned, an extension of the mansion. It is a place for us to continue interpreting and talking about the stories that Dylan mentioned, talking about that puzzle that Dave has been so instrumental in putting together, and the plants that Ryan is working on cultivating in this space. So it is a location where we have an opportunity to talk about all different kinds of things, not just the fact that the garden is a space where it's beautiful, it's lovely, it's gorgeous, but to get into some of those deeper topics about slavery, about rights, and about other things that happened or may have happened within that space. But we're also able to use the garden as an experiential learning opportunity. We're really looking forward to the things that we'll be able to do once the garden is complete, once the construction is complete, and we're able to take people in. I'm really excited about getting people digging in the dirt with us as special programs and learning about the plants that are in there. But I'm also really excited that we have already started doing programs in which we use material from the garden. You can see one of the pages from our Learning from Home part of the website, which I did put the link in the chat a little bit earlier. So if you scroll up, you can find this one fairly easily in that Learning from Home section. We have done unfacilitated experiences like this sweet potatoes broiled recipe, which we adapted for a modern kitchen. We're also doing live virtual programming like our History in the Kitchen program, which I was super excited last fall to be able to use turnip, kale, and collard greens that Ryan had cultivated to talk about a recipe made by people who were enslaved, possibly by people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall. We know that many of those individuals were providing greens to the people who held their livelihoods. So this has been an amazing experience and will continue to be an opportunity for us to talk about how the garden played into what we were doing in the 18th century, but also to keep our hands in the garden and use materials from it to start talking about the plants, the ideas, and get people's hands on it. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to wrap us up, and then I believe we'll be taking some questions.
Thank you. We've got one more segment that I want to make sure we include, and that is I'd like to bring Ryan back to help everybody understand how we're using this garden also to serve as a community resource. So the garden is for us, it's something that we think is a really important addition to help make the space at Gunston Hall more authentic, to help us be able to tell more stories. We think it's going to be, once we're able to invite visitors in, going to be one of the most precious parts of people's visit, as it will be a beautiful space full of rich stories, interesting smells and sights. But it also is a space we're able to use to help benefit our community. And so Ryan, if you would talk just a little bit about that, that would be excellent.
Certainly, and just this big idea, I guess I sometimes have, gardening is really a universal language, and it's just such an amazing way for people to connect with a space such as Gunston Hall. And it really takes a lot of help and a lot of resources to be successful. And we're looking forward to building our volunteer corps. And we also hope, sort of on the other side of that, that we're able to give back a lot in return. And so we've been as strategic as possible in thinking about this. And so some of the things that we've looked to get help on, some of the inputs, just ideas and knowledge. And, I'm always on the phone with someone asking, getting a second opinion, just because we want to make sure things go well. And some of the seeds here that we see growing, we actually acquired from Monticello, and they were able to help us in an immense way in acquiring really hundreds of different types of 18th century varieties. But, we're also partnering with other people just to acquire things like manure, which we know is just this amazing soil amendment that was used in the 18th century. And of course, getting help in the garden. And so having volunteers, it really takes a village to pull this off. And what that means, some of the other groups, we have museums that have helped us advise and share. Dean Norton, the lead horticulturist at Mount Vernon, is just fantastic in sharing his expertise. Other nonprofits, Virginia State University, just using their resources and reaching out to some of the faculty there. Seed companies have helped us. Other educators coming in and sharing their expertise on a program, that sort of thing, and just local area neighbors. Some of the outputs, though, Lacey certainly talked about the interpretation and the educational content. We want to really be able to share the produce, and these are some of the turnips that we were able to donate this past season. We were also able to share immature black-eyed pea seeds, which right here, they're fantastic, just like green beans, and they were delicious. We were able to get those to the Lorton Community Action Center that manages a food bank program, and we're looking to partner with them early on this year in terms of sharing even some of those plant materials we saw, so people can not only get our produce but also grow their own in their gardens at home. So we're really looking at this in a strategic way as possible, and thinking hard about what goes into the garden and how people can connect there, and also what comes out of the garden and how we can connect people to those things. Because it's so important in building our community presence and just being a good neighbor, honestly. We really want people to be able to make personal connections and try to make our work useful to those that are near to us, and also digitally, those that are far from us. So that's kind of some of the things we're thinking about, but we're of course going to be thinking about more. This is evolving over time, which is part of why it's so excited to just get people in the garden space and keep growing.
Thank you, Ryan. We are delighted to take questions right now. We also want to make sure that you know how to get in touch with us in the future. And here is an email address that you may use to reach any of us. That's historic@gunstonhall.org. And there is Gunston Hall's telephone number. So you may find that information also on our website, which is www.gunstonhall.org. I believe that has been in the chat a couple of times. So do visit us, learn more from our website, send us questions, call us, come visit us. But right now, we'd be thrilled to answer any questions that anyone has for us.
All right, thank you all so much. That was really interesting. And I have questions, but I'm going to wait to see if anybody would like to type theirs into the chat before I start asking questions.
Well, the hardest thing for us, Tina, I'm sure you can empathize, is figuring out how little to tell. Each one of us could have done a 45-minute talk on the segment that we were discussing,
Yeah.
But we wanted to make sure that we gave everyone a little sampler of the entire project. What else was found in the garden digs? Dave, do you want to talk about some of the other things that you found?
I think really the most surprising thing we found was the configuration of the terrace. For years, the terrace had been assumed to be a single step, a single broad platform. But we were able to tease apart the soil a little and find out that it had entirely different configuration. And when we did the documentary research on it, we found that an owner of Gunston Hall back in the late 19th and early 20th century had decided he wanted a formal garden because the space occupied by Mason's garden was occupied by an orchard at the time. So he took and removed the soil, the soil from one of the terrace steps and pushed it onto a lower terrace step to form one broad step. And he also, the terrace, I'm sorry we didn't have a picture of the terrace, but the terrace has projections or mounts extending out beyond the lip of the terrace. And there was one in the center that he also took out to make a formal garden, a broad formal garden. And then he built a pavilion above that formal garden. So we were able to find in the soil enough information so the original configuration of that garden has been put back together. Now, if I may continue with another kind of interesting find, and this happens to be a series of seeds from a plant that was thought not to have occurred in North America until the early 19th century. And this was a kind of spider flower called Cleome spinosa. And we were finding seeds in trash deposits of this Cleome spinosa plant that George Mason had back in the 18th century, well before it was thought to ever occur in North America. So what we're assuming is that one or more of Mason's sea captain friends was bringing plant materials back to Mason from the Caribbean area where this Cleome spinosa originated. And he was actually planting these seeds for the first time, plants for the first time in North America that did not actually become available until much later. Okay.
All right. So with the garden, was there, because Mason seemed to have had a very good idea of what he wanted, was there, and Thomas Jefferson always seemed willing to offer any kind of gardening advice that he could. Was there any correspondence between them about planting a garden and what grew and the layout of a garden?
Ryan, would you like to talk about correspondence between Jefferson and Mason and maybe Washington and Mason and some of the other founders?
Certainly, absolutely. We know there is quite a bit of correspondence, and it's quite fascinating because we get a sense of, how George Mason was a horticulturist. He'll always include sort of detailed little recommendations about how you should secure the seeds against pests, or you know, you need to wrap these cuttings in peat moss. Like, he's very interested in making sure anything that is being exchanged or swapped is done correctly. And this is what's common. There are seeds going between Mount Vernon and Gunston Hall, and Monticello and Gunston Hall. And one of the other ways that's really fascinating that we know a lot about this is just reading Washington's diary. And it's kind of a genre of entry. He'll list, you know, a half dozen different types of pears, and then it will say from Colonel Mason, or a couple types of apples from Colonel Mason, planted 3 dozen cherries. And so from that, we can see that not only is this exchange pretty diverse in the plant materials, but it is sustained over a period of decades. And so you really get a sense of this being a pretty substantial relationship, even if we can't flesh out all the moments and points when these folks were conversing and all. We don't have the full dialogue, of course, but we can see that it was quite substantial.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Just like Lacey shared in the chat. And that's fascinating too, because that moment was right after the sort of Mount Vernon Accords, where they sort of settle some deals with Maryland. And so it's this sort of political ideas and gardening side by side. And that's also a pretty common feature in a lot of these exchanges.
Okay, yeah. And another question I had about, I guess the layout and the philosophy of the garden. The garden is on the river side of the property. Am I correct? Do I understand that correctly? How would most visitors have been approaching Gunston Hall? Would they have been coming off the river or from the roadside? And how, here we can see the terracing, how, you know, from the riverside, you would be still kind of in the wild area. And as you move slowly further up the house, the area becomes more organized and laid out. And like Mason, it was all very logical and symmetrical, sort of this movement from wildness into order. So I guess my basic question is, I mean, where would people have encountered this garden first? Coming up from the river, or having been brought through and then out the door?
That's a really good question, Tina. And I think we are a little misled today by what exists in terms of forestation. And so today, most people visit from the land side. So this is the original lane. It still exists. We've added a little lane over here, and we have parking lots over here. But most people see the mansion from the land side. We think that was probably quite different in the 18th century. That many people encountered the property from the riverside. So they came up. There was a road that went along here, the side of the garden, and then over to the wharf, which was off to, you can see in the distance, Belmont Bay and the Potomac is over here. Gunston Hall is surrounded on 3 sides by water. And so much of what is forested today was in cultivation for cash crops. The Gunston Hall plantation had fields for wheat, for corn, and for tobacco production. And so there was an awful lot of land that was cleared, which meant that people could see Gunston Hall from the river. And in fact, what was the most defining feature we have come to understand was this fence. This fence is visible from very far away. And as people came up from the wharf along a pretty fine road with cultivated fields on either sides and some work buildings visible, that they could see the mansion and the fence from different vantage points. And in fact, one of the researchers for this project spent a lot of time thinking about the view sheds and was able to unravel just how thoughtful the Masons were about the placement of the mansion and the placement of these terraces it looks as if they're cut into a natural hillside, and they are to some extent. But the Masons chose to have that hillside reshaped, not just in terms of cutting in the terraces, but they reoriented the hillside. They chopped off part of the hill on one side and they built up the other part because they wanted the hill to face a slightly different direction. And that was all about what they could see from inside and what people could see from outside as they approached. So I think that that's just a very perceptive question, Tina, about the views. It was one of the most important questions on the minds of the Masons when they were designing this space, not just what was inside the garden, but the overall physical sort of dominance of the garden on the landscape.
Okay. I have a couple more questions. Please, if any of you have questions, please type them into the chat. This refers to the enslaved workers. I noticed that there were a few names mentioned. I think Cato and Orinoco in the presentation. And are these enslaved workers that you know something about, who would have been working in the garden?
So we know less about people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall than we would like. I think that's probably true for just about every site. We know the names of about 36 people who were, about 36 people are named in George Mason's will, and then we know the names of a few other people also. We have some information about what some people did, and we've made guesses based on the little bit of information that we have about some of those people who were enslaved. We can imagine that someone who was named Liberty, for instance, we know was a carpenter. And based on the kind of work that we understand he did, we believe that he's someone who probably helped keep that fence in good repair. We do not know the name of the person who was the head gardener, for instance. We're almost certain that was someone who was enslaved and someone who had a tremendous amount of skill. All of this plant diversity, all of the understanding how to care for these different kinds of plants was not something that someone just kind of fell into. This took years of study and practice. The fruit trees alone involved a great deal of grafting technology, and someone needed to practice for a long time to be successful at that. And so the people who were working in this garden were tremendously skilled people. We, again, can guess that someone such as Cato, someone such as Orinoco might have worked in that space. Bridget and Ancilla might have worked in that space, but we don't know with certainty.
Okay. And as far as the plantings go, do you get a sense of, like, with all of these different fruit trees, how successful they were? Did they survive? Were they able to grow enough to make this barrier that they wanted? And at the same time, I guess they ate the fruit, or was it more decorative? Well, I know that was always an issue.
Absolutely. The fruit trees in the garden were a small fraction of the fruit trees on the Gunston Hall plantation as a whole. Ryan, would you like to talk about, you are just in the thick of fruit trees right now.
Well, sure. Yeah, and so we believe that there would have been more substantial orchard plantings elsewhere on the property. And those would have been full-size fruit trees and at that spread, certainly in a way that they would produce a lot of fruit. Cider is such an important part of what's going on, but they're also making vinegar, which is this multi-purpose tool for everything, preserving, etc. So apples were these really useful things, and you would definitely need more apples than were just in that garden. That said, though, of the apples that are there and the other fruit trees that are there are really remarkable things. We might think of them today as dessert varieties. And so these would be things that would kind of finish the meal or lead it off. And having those and being able to show those to your guests would have, put your hospitality in a class above other places that might not have that kind of time to engage in growing, apples that maybe we're a little bit more finicky. And again, that grafting element is there too. So these are all on a stock that's going to keep them a little bit smaller and allow them to be trained, create that barrier, and create that visual aesthetic that they were going for. So all of those things were going into it. And, you know, certainly they would have suffered attrition. But we believe during that time period when George Mason is attending to them and they're getting the care that they need, they certainly are going to fill out over a period of, you know, 5 to 10 years. They would kind of cover that gap.
Okay. Any, from Mitchell, we visited Gunston Hall about 2 years ago and enjoyed the house tour very much, as well as walking the grounds. We look forward to another visit. Okay. When do you have a date of when you expect this to be finished? I mean, I guess it's never finished since it's a garden, and but how to be able to be where you can say this is what we think it was like in George Mason's time, just a finished product, I guess.
So for us, the big question is, when will the construction fence come down and we may invite visitors into the garden? And that's really weather dependent. I understand that in South Carolina, you have a big weather event coming up today, bad weather, and that bad weather is just the curse for doing any earthworks. So that terracing requires a good amount of dry weather, and warm is a good thing too. So we are hopeful that at the end of the spring, all of the construction will be done and we will be able to invite guests in to be within that garden space. We will let you all know. We will trumpet to the heavens when we're able to let people in. We're so eager to take people inside the garden. We are, in terms of the garden planting being done, I mean, I think you're right, Tina, it will never be done. And we are certainly aware that those fruit trees that we're going to be planting, well, they're little bitty ones. So it will be such fun for people over years and years to see those fruit trees grow, see how we're training them. So they'll be espaliered and cordon. So, you know, they'll be trained for their branches to go just in one plane. And then we'll continue filling in with more bulbs and more perennials. We'll be experimenting with the different kinds of vegetables. There will be something new to see for many, many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments before we let these wonderful people go back to their jobs?
Well, this is such fun. We loved talking with you about our project.
Well, thank you to you, Rebecca, and Dylan, and Dave, and Ryan, and Lacey, and Scott, although it doesn't look like he's with us now, but this has been really wonderful, really interesting, and very exciting. So hopefully when we're all comfortable traveling again, we will get up that way. So,
we love to welcome every one of you.
So thank you. So thank you all so much. And if you're free at 10 o'clock, April 1st, please join us at the Bergman Wright House in Wilmington in about 2 weeks. So thank you, everybody.